For many people, the best moment of the day is coming home and being greeted by their pet, because there's a presence there that asks for nothing. It doesn't question you. It doesn't demand explanations. It doesn't misunderstand. Over time, that presence turns into conversation, into routine, into an emotional reference point. You talk to your pet the way you would to someone close. You share things. You respond to expressions. You create meaning. And it all happens so naturally that almost no one stops to think about it. At some point, the pet stops being just an animal. It becomes companionship, support, someone who gets it. And that doesn't feel strange at all. In fact, for many people, it feels like the safest form of connection available today. While human relationships require negotiation, patience, and risk, this bond operates in silence, routine, and predictability, and maybe that's exactly what makes it so powerful. This video explores something subtle, why this kind of bond makes so much sense to so many people, and what it quietly reveals about how we relate, how we trust, and how we seek presence. You might recognize yourself in this more than you expect. Before we continue, a simple request. If this topic feels familiar, leaving a like helps this video reach more people. It's a quiet way of saying, this makes sense to me. Now let's move on. Seeing pets as members of the family is becoming more and more common, not just as companions, but as central presences in people's emotional lives. They're part of routines, shared silences, hard moments, and ordinary days. And little by little, they start to occupy a place that goes beyond care. A place of attachment. What's interesting is that this is rarely a conscious decision. No one wakes up one day thinking they're going to treat an animal like a person. It happens gradually, through living together, through repetition, through that steady sense of consistency. Your pet is there every day, reacting, recognizing you, responding to your presence. And that predictability creates something incredibly powerful: emotional safety. For many people, that safety isn't just nice, it's necessary. Human relationships can be unstable, ambiguous, and full of unspoken expectations. A relationship with an animal is more straightforward. It doesn't require emotional performance. It doesn't demand constant coherence. It doesn't shift tone unpredictably. That's the context where humanizing pets shows up, not as confusion, but as an emotional language. People interpret gestures, project inner states, talk to them, assign intention, not because they literally believe the animal thinks like a human, but because this way of relating makes bonding easier. It makes the connection feel closer, more alive, more understandable. There's also something important happening psychologically. The pet becomes a safe space for emotional expression. Joy, exhaustion, frustration, affection, all of it can be shown without fear of being judged. The animal doesn't give you sarcasm, criticism, or emotional distance back. It gives you presence. That's why, for many people, being with their pet becomes the most regulating moment of the day, a pause button, a place where they feel like they can be exactly as they are. And when a relationship offers that consistently, it starts to carry real emotional weight. What doesn't get talked about as often is that this kind of bond isn't only about loving about how human relationships have become more demanding and at the same time more fragile. Connecting with people involves risk. It involves frustration. It involves the constant possibility of missing each other emotionally. With a pet, the bond feels steadier, more predictable, less threatening. That doesn't mean people who humanize their pets are avoiding humans or replacing relationships. Most of the time, it's about complementing. The animal fills a space that was already there, a space for steady presence, simple contact, affection without constant negotiation. But when that space becomes too central, it starts to reveal something about what's missing or what's becoming harder in human relationships. Not as an individual failure, but as a reflection of a larger emotional context. A context where trust is rarer, time is more fragmented, and intimacy takes more work. In that sense, seeing pets, like people, isn't an exaggeration. It's an adaptation, a way to keep connection alive in a world that doesn't always make emotional connection between humans easy. And the more natural this feels, the more interesting it becomes to look at what this kind of relationship provides and why it's become so important for so many people. When you observe it carefully, without judgment, it starts to reveal layers that go far beyond animals. It reveals something about presence, affection, and the way we've learned to connect today. When someone starts to notice how much emotional space the bond with a pet occupies, it rarely comes with a sense of strangeness. Quite the opposite, it usually feels coherent. It makes sense to trust someone who's always there. It makes sense to grow attached to a presence that doesn't fluctuate. It makes sense to invest affection where it's returned in a predictable way. What's rarely noticed is how that predictability works on the mind. Human relationships are full of gray areas. People change moods, interpret things differently, pull away without warning, get frustrated, disappoint others. That requires constant emotional reading. A bond with an animal, on the other hand, offers something more stable: simple responses, clear patterns, a continuous sense of acceptance. Over time, that difference starts to matter. Not dramatically, but subtly. A person may realize they feel more comfortable being affectionate with their pet than with other people, that it's easier to show care, attention, and even vulnerability there. Not because they love the humans around them less, but because the emotional risk is lower. This shift doesn't happen because of rejection of people, but because of emotional economy. The pet becomes a place where affection can flow without friction, where there's no need to explain feelings, where there's no expectation of complex reciprocity. That creates a sense of psychological rest that's hard to find in other relationships. Another important factor is that animals offer a form of continuous presence. They don't compete with screens, schedules, or internal distractions. They're there in the same physical space, responding to body language, tone of voice, movement. In a world increasingly mediated by interfaces, this kind of steady physical presence becomes incredibly valuable. That's why many people start organizing parts of their day around their pet, not just out of responsibility, but out of pleasure. Walking, feeding, playing, observing. These simple actions create a routine of care that structures time and offers a sense of emotional usefulness. Taking care of someone who responds with closeness creates meaning. Humanization emerges here as an emotional bridge, giving the animal a voice, interpreting behaviors as intentions, creating imagined dialogues. All of this helps bring the relationship closer to the way we're used to bonding. It's a way of translating affection into a familiar language. What's interesting is that this translation doesn't demand perfection. The pet doesn't require consistency, doesn't confront contradictions, doesn't ask for explanations. The relationship holds even when the person is tired, confused, or emotionally unavailable, and that makes the bond feel easier, lighter, more reliable. But that ease also raises a quiet question. What happens when a large part of emotional safety comes from relationships that don't challenge, disagree, or require negotiation? Not as a criticism, but as an observation. Because human relationships, as difficult as they are also where emotional growth happens. When the pet becomes the main source of comfort, there can be a gradual tendency to avoid human conflict, not out of incapacity but comparison. Why invest energy in relationships that demand so much when there's a simpler, steadier source of affection? This shift isn't conscious. It happens slowly. The person continues relating to others but becomes more selective about where they invest emotionally. The pet becomes the safe place. Other relationships become more peripheral, more controlled. None of this is inherently wrong, but it is revealing. It shows how we're reorganizing our sources of connection. It shows how much we're seeking relationships that offer care without overexposure. It reveals a growing need for emotional safety in a context of relational instability. Looking at this pattern with curiosity rather than judgment helps explain why so many people feel their pets understand everything. Maybe it's not about understanding in a human sense. Maybe it's about something more basic: presence without threat, affection without demands, connection without constant wear. And that by itself says a lot about the kind of connection we're looking for. The relationship with a pet is often one of the few where a person feels they don't have to edit themselves. There's no need to choose words carefully, adjust reactions, or anticipate interpretations. Presence can be simple, and that simplicity has a profound effect. In human relationships, we're almost always negotiating versions of ourselves. Even in the closest bonds, there's some level of adaptation, a careful choice of words, an emotional filter. With a pet, that layer disappears. A person can be quiet, irritated, affectionate, or distracted, and the bond remains intact. This creates a rare sense of emotional continuity. Over time, this experience begins to reshape what the person understands as connection. Bonding becomes associated with the absence of friction. The less conflict, the safer it feels. The fewer demands, the more comfortable it becomes. And without realizing it, the person may start to feel uneasy in human relationships precisely because they don't work this way. Another interesting point is how humanizing pets helps organize difficult emotions. By projecting feelings, thoughts, or intentions onto the animal, the person finds an indirect way to process what they feel. Talking to a pet becomes a kind of accompanied monologue, a space where thoughts can exist without being interrupted or questioned. This doesn't mean confusion between reality and imagination. It means using the relationship creatively for emotional self-regulation. The pet functions as a presence that allows thinking out loud, feeling without urgency, existing without explanation. And that's something many human interactions increasingly lack as they become faster and more fragmented. There's also an element of emotional control involved. With an animal, the person knows what to expect. They know how the bond responds. There are no complex emotional surprises. That predictability reduces anxiety. In a world where so many relationships feel unstable or uncertain, this has enormous value. But predictability also shapes expectations. When someone spends a lot of time in bonds without confrontation, they may lose tolerance for the normal frustrations of human relationships. Small conflicts start to feel overwhelming, differences begin to feel threatening, the comparison is quiet but constant. What's most interesting is that this doesn't come from a lack of interest in people. Often it happens precisely because the person values connection deeply and wants to protect it from wear and tear. The pet becomes the place where affection can flow without risk. Human relationships are reserved for more controlled, more careful, less spontaneous interactions. This emotional arrangement works for a while. It offers comfort, stability, and a sense of belonging. But it also creates a split. On one side, relationships that are safe and simple. On the other, relationships that are complex and demanding. And that split starts to influence choices, priorities, and even how the person sees themselves. In this context, humanizing a pet isn't emotional exaggeration. It's a way of making visible something that's happening internally, an attempt to maintain closeness in an emotional environment that feels increasingly hard to sustain with other people. Looking at this movement closely helps us understand not just our relationship with animals, but how we're dealing with intimacy, presence, and vulnerability. Because in the end, the bond with a pet often works as a silent mirror of emotional needs that are still looking for a place in human relationships. And that's where the topic starts to get really interesting. Over time, this kind of bond begins to shape something even deeper. The way a person understands intimacy, intimacy starts to be associated with constant comfort, the absence of conflict, and a sense of emotional control. And when that happens, human relationships, which inevitably involve friction, can start to feel overwhelmingly exhausting. A pet offers a predictable form of intimacy. They are present, they respond to care, they move alongside daily life. They don't require long explanations, don't bring complex moral dilemmas, don't question choices. This consistency creates a stable emotional base. But human intimacy works differently. It grows precisely in the space where differences, misunderstandings, and the need for adjustment exist. When someone becomes accustomed to a bond that doesn't require negotiation, they may begin, often without realizing it, to avoid situations that call for difficult conversations. Not because they're incapable, but because of comparison. The body learns where it feels safest and starts to seek that place more often. This helps explain why some people feel more emotionally available with their pets than with partners, friends, or family, not because they love those people less, but because there's less risk of emotional failure. There's no possibility of saying the wrong thing, disappointing someone, or being misunderstood. There's also an issue of pace. Human relationships require time, active presence, and a willingness to deal with ambiguity. The bond with a pet, on the other hand, fits easily into daily routines. The pet follows the person's rhythm. It waits, it adapts. That flexibility creates a sense of attunement that isn't always possible between humans. What's interesting is that for many people, this dynamic doesn't replace human relationships. It reshapes what they expect from them. Tolerance for conflict decreases. Patience for long emotional processes shrinks. The person begins to choose bonds that are easier, more predictable, quieter. This doesn't mean emotional impoverishment. It means reorganization. An attempt to protect one's own balance in a world where relationships feel increasingly demanding and less reliable. The pet becomes an anchor point, a place where affection doesn't get lost, but every anchor also limits movement. When a large part of emotional security is concentrated in a bond that doesn't return complexity, the person may stop exercising important skills, dealing with frustration, holding difficult conversations, tolerating differences without shutting down. Those skills don't disappear, but they become less active, and like any capacity that isn't used, they become harder to access when needed. The result is a strange feeling. The person feels emotionally connected, yet less willing to expose themselves in deep human relationships. This isn't an individual failure. It's a reflection of the emotional context we live in. A context where predictability has become rare, trust feels fragile, and relational exhaustion is common. In that scenario, seeking simpler bonds is an understandable response. Observing this movement carefully allows for something important, noticing where comfort is helping and where it may be limiting. Not to give up the bond with a pet, but to understand it, what it's compensating for, what it offers so efficiently that other relationships are struggling to provide in the same way. This kind of observation doesn't demand immediate change. It asks for awareness. Because awareness is where space opens up for broader choices, choices that include comfort without being confined to it. Perhaps the most important point in this reflection is realizing that seeing pets as people is not a problem in itself. For many people, it's a genuine source of affection, balance, and meaning. A bond with an animal can be deep, regulating, and emotionally healthy. It offers presence, consistency, and a form of care that for many is essential. What's worth paying attention to isn't the love for pets, but the place that love occupies. When it becomes the primary source of emotional safety, it starts to tell a larger story, not about excess, but about need, about how we're learning to protect ourselves, to bond, and to deal with the complexity of human relationships. Animals offer something rare, closeness without symbolic conflict. They don't require a person to maintain coherent versions of themselves. They don't demand constant emotional alignment. They don't put the relationship at risk over disagreement. This creates a kind of bond that is deeply comfortable, and comfort, when it becomes too central, can reduce our willingness to take the risks that human intimacy inevitably involves. Human relationships aren't just sources of affection, they are spaces for growth, growth that involves frustration, adjustment, negotiation, and sometimes disappointment. When someone becomes used primarily to bonds where these stages don't exist, they may begin, often without realizing it, to avoid relationships that require more emotional exposure. This doesn't mean the bond with a pet is taking the wrong place. It means it may be filling something that has become harder to find elsewhere. Real presence, shared time, undivided attention, affection without performance. Maybe the most honest question isn't why do people humanize their pets, but what's missing in human relationships that makes this kind of bond so central? This shift doesn't happen by accident. It reflects an emotional world that is more tired, more guarded, and more careful about where it invests energy. When this dynamic is observed with gentleness, something opens up. A person can continue to love their animal deeply without turning that bond into a silent comparison with every other relationship. They can recognize the comfort this connection provides while also seeing where it doesn't replace the complexity of being with another person. Balance isn't about choosing between humans and animals. It's about not concentrating all emotional safety in a single type of relationship. It's about allowing a pet to be companionship without asking it to carry the weight of being the primary source of deep connection. In the end, humanizing an animal says less about emotional confusion and more about adaptation. Adaptation to a world where being close has become harder, faster, and more demanding. Looking at this with curiosity rather than guilt creates space for relationships that are more conscious, more diverse, and more honest. If this topic resonated with you, leave a comment. It can be an experience, an observation, or simply something that stayed with you while watching. Conversations like this grow stronger when more people recognize that these bonds say a lot about who we are and about the time we're living in.